Coming to you from Jacksonville, Florida, this is GovLove, a podcast about local government brought to you by engaging local government leaders. I'm Ben Kittelson, manager at Reftels and GovLove co-host. We've got a great episode for you today. We're going to be talking transportation engineering. But first, the best way to support GovLove is to become an ELGO member. Engaging local government leaders is a professional association engaging the brightest minds in local government. And you can follow. You can also give GovLove a follow on LinkedIn, so you'll never miss an episode. Go ahead and give our page a follow there, and tell us about the different things you're learning as you're listening to our podcast. Now, let me introduce today's guest. Dr. Wes Marshall is a professional of civil engineering at the University of Colorado, Denver, where he holds a joint appointment in urban planning. He's also the director of CU Denver's Human Centered Transportation Program and the Transportation Research Center. He's a licensed professional engineer and is the author of Killed by a Traffic Engineer, a recent book that we're going to talk a fair bit about today. So with that, welcome to GovLove, Wes. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here, Ben.
Awesome. So we have a tradition on the podcast to start with a lightning round to get to know you a little better, let you warm up. So my first question for you is, what was the first album that you bought?
First album I bought. I think I got a boombox when I was like 9 or 10, and the first album I bought was actually the Back to the Future soundtrack.
Oh, nice.
I think at the time you think, oh, you get all these different songs from different artists in one thing. It was Huey Lewis and the News, and they actually played the songs that, like Johnny Be Good that Marty plays in the movie, and like the Marvin Berry song Earth Angel right before. And when I was 10, I loved it.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's a great first album. That was awesome. I was going to ask what the highlights were, but because I don't know that I've had that soundtrack or heard it recently, at least. Very cool.
It's still a good movie. It holds up.
Yeah. All right. So my next lightning round question for you: what book are you currently reading?
It's a few books right now. I'm reading. The more transportation-y book I'm reading is called Order Without Design: How Markets Shape Cities. But I was having a really tough time with it. Haven't been the biggest fan of it, so I've been sort of struggling through it. So because of that, I've been reading a bunch of other books at the same time. I'm reading a Stephen King book. It's actually about the Boston Red Sox in like the 2003-04 season, where he's kind of going through that with another co-author. I don't know if anyone's read the Harlan Coben books, but I'm reading one of those at the same time. Those are always a fun, quick read. It's hard to remember the titles, like they all get mixed up, but I love reading those. I think there was something else. What else was I reading? I sometimes do Audible, especially when I bike ride. So I just reread The Power Broker, but I did it over Audible. So I figured I was started into Robert Caro's Lyndon Johnson series. So I just started the first book in that series.
That might be a good way to get through Robert Caro books, because the Power Broker is one of those books that's very intimidating, and it's sat on my shelf for years.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed the Audible version. Sometimes you kind of wish you could rewind a little bit and listen to some parts again, because if your mind wanders a little bit, and that's hard to do while I'm biking, like it's easier to do when you have the book in front of you. But I know you catch different things. Like it was a different experience than reading it, so I definitely enjoyed it, and I definitely got used to whoever was reading that's voice, and it was a good one, so it worked well.
That many hours with them,
Oh yeah,
get to know them. Yeah. All right, my next later question for you: what's the last great thing you watched? Movie or TV show?
My youngest is 13, and she wanted to watch Parks and Rec. So we've been rewatching that. I saw it years ago, and I've been watching that, and it is really so good. Like not the first season I don't love, but after that, it's just really, really good, and a lot of it holds up and speaks to lots of what's happening now in government. So I've been enjoying it more than I thought the second time through.
Yeah. You're in good company with being a Parks and Rec fan, and I noticed in the book there's several footnotes and quotes from Parks and Rec, so I appreciate.
Yeah, that. I would ride for that more than like The Office and things like that. I mean, The Office has some good seasons too, but the characters in Parks and Rec are just so good.
Yeah, no, I agree. Well, and I will say the first season isn't as good as the later seasons, but it is maybe the best parody of local government of the seasons, because there are some things like that are too real.
Well, it's funny because I've been listening a little bit to the 99% Invisible podcast is doing a reread of The Power Broker, and they've had special guests on each month as they're doing it. And one of them was Michael Schur, the creator of Parks and Rec, and he was talking about having read The Power Broker in the creation of that show, and he thinks about Leslie Knope's character That's kind of like Robert Moses, but good. Like that's one of the ways he kind of wrapped his head around it. So I didn't realize that at the time, but given that I'm kind of doing all this at the same time, it made sense. Like I see it.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I like that interpretation of Leslie Knope. That's cool. All right, then my last linear question for you: where do you go for inspiration?
It's funny. I do listen to transportation related podcasts. I read a lot of transportation related books, but I really don't go there for inspiration. I find if I'm only kind of steeped in that stuff, my research becomes kind of boring.
Mm,
So I try to step out, and I mean, as you can kind of tell by what we just talked about, I go all different directions, and like I sort of never know when it's like I'll be inspired by something. I might like read a book about economics and like, oh, let's do this, or I don't know. Always things are coming up, and I never know or expect where they are. But when I try to think through things, like it's best to do as I sort of come to work on my bike, like that's the
mm.
time like things coalesce for me.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good way to both start the day and decompress on a day too. Yeah,
Yeah.
I love it. Awesome. And then, so I'm curious, one of the things I like to ask guests, and before we get into kind of your book and some of your research, so I'm curious, what was your path to like getting into this field, and like how did you end up, as a professor doing doing traffic engineering, like and research, like how'd you kind of end up in this field?
It's kind of a long story, but I mean, I grew up in the Boston area, and like as a kid, I never really thought about transportation because I could just walk or bike everywhere. I could, jump on the bus, get to Harvard Square, and from there take the Red Line to what felt like anywhere. So I never
Mhm.
really thought about it. So when I went to college, University of Virginia, I ended up picking civil engineering, not really knowing what part of it I was most interested in, but thinking it's really broad. I could do a lot of things. So at first, I was more focused on the structural engineering side of things, like thinking, maybe become an architect someday. It's kind of nice to come at that from maybe, with a structural background. But over time, I sort of realized that a lot of that work, the computer does it for you. There's not much thinking involved. Like once the beam is big enough, you can make it bigger. It might cost you more, but it's going to be safer and everything's fine. But when I got into the workplace and we started doing, I was doing site engineering work where we're doing a little bit of structural, a little bit of hydrology, a little bit of transportation. And the transportation piece was always the most interesting to me, because once you add humans to the mix, like things are often counterintuitive.
Hmm.
And like even at the good firm I was at, like we were still building things. I was like, why isn't this as good as the stuff I saw in and around me in the Boston area?
Hmm.
Eventually I moved to Connecticut, and that was the first time I lived in a place where I couldn't leave my street without being in a car.
Hmm.
And it drove me crazy. And I always was sort of asking questions and curious, like, why do we build it like this? Like I can see a corner store and I can't get there without a car. And I would ask my neighbors about it, and none of them knew any differently. They're like, well, who cares? Just drive there. And I was like, I couldn't understand it. So eventually my pet peeves led me to go back and get
Yeah.
a master's and a PhD in this. And, it's really, I've sort of made a career over researching the things that drive me crazy.
Yeah. They're probably worse things to research, Oh, that's
But
cool.
everybody has these. Everybody has stuff in transportation that drives them crazy. I mean, most people go about their day and don't really think about it again. But I'm guess I'm not like that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah. Well, and it's interesting that you went at it that way, where you were used to like being a walkable and transit oriented place. And then you go to somewhere else and you're like, this is missing. Do you guys not realize it?
Oh yeah, and nobody could understand what I was talking about. I
Mhm.
mean, I feel like a lot of people that do the general kind of stuff I do come at it from either the way I did or the opposite. They
Yeah.
grow up in a very suburban place where they, as a kid, they had to be chauffeured everywhere. Then they finally moved to a city where they have more freedom and more options to get around, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, like this is amazing!" And so yeah, there's kind of two paths to the origin story of people in my world.
Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah, and I can relate to that second path because yeah, going from a place where growing up in a suburb, I grew up in a suburb of Portland, Oregon, and going from a place where you have to drive everywhere to like, a more transit oriented, walkable place, it does feel like you're like you have this new freedom that you didn't even know existed before.
Oh yeah, very much so.
So, I mentioned the title of your book, but I'm curious. Obviously you're doing research, you've got all sorts of, I'm sure, teaching and other academic work. So, but what made you want to put this down in a book that's you know um, we were talking before we started recording that it's quite long, but it's very readable and friendly and like and approachable. So, I'm curious, like what before we get into kind of the meat of it, like what made you want to write this book, and how'd you decide on kind of the audience that you've chosen for it? It seems like.
So, I mean, I became a professor in 2009, so I've been doing this for 15 years now. And I mean, that and even during, when I was in grad school, I have, 75 or 80 like peer-reviewed published papers that are in journals out there. And
Mm-hmm.
those are very academic. They're, but with that kind of work, I'm always felt like I was chipping away at the tip of the iceberg in terms of the problems that I was seeing. The book gave me a chance to kind of go after the foundation a little bit and
Mm-hmm.
have a chance to understand like where all this stuff comes from. Like, why do we do what we do? And, when you see there isn't nearly as much science as, us traffic engineers even think, like you realize the foundation isn't solid. So I felt like it had to be something bigger. Like this couldn't be, just a few papers on the topic. But then at the same time, I'm, literally writing about millions of people dying on the roads. I'm literally writing about kids dying. So there had to be a little bit of levity to it in some way, or else it would
Mm-hmm.
be a tough read. And, this also gave me a chance to write a little bit less academic and more like I would normally write. I think I obviously read a lot too, and I know what I like and I know what I don't like. And I mentioned that Order Without Design book. Like one of the reasons I've had such a trouble getting through it is like each chapter is like 2 hours long. I've been reading it on my Kindle, and they get that little thing in the corner, and it's just a slog. So I wanted to go the other direction and have a lot of short chapters. So I have 88 short chapters. Each one has a beginning, middle, and end. And each one is kind of set into these. There's 12 different parts that big umbrella of the book, and each of those parts has like a beginning, middle, and end.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to do something different and really get at the foundation. So that it's kind of a long answer there, but it's the big picture issues I was seeing and why I kind of went this direction.
Yeah. Well, and that was one of the things, as I was going through it, that kept surprising me is you'd bring up a standard or an example of like, this is the way we do things in traffic engineering. And you would poke at the reason why. And then it'd be like, some study from 80 years ago that had like 10 people participate or something. So can you talk a little about kind of that as you were digging into the history and some of the foundations of this, this school of thought, the science, like were you finding that you wanted to share share more broadly?
I mean, when I first thought of this book, I mean, one approach would be to be like, well, here's what we do wrong. But I felt like that would never be enough. I
Mm.
also needed to explain why we did it. So I went down a lot of these rabbit holes, which meant, literally reading hundreds of old journal articles and books from the 1930s, 40s, 50s. And I wanted to really see that. I mean, because traffic engineering has been around for 100 years. And like when I got into the workforce as a young engineer, you're just handed all these 1,000-page guidebooks. So there's about a half a dozen of these guidebooks we use. And as a young engineer, you think, well, whoever wrote these knows more than I do. Whoever wrote
Mhm.
these must have done their research. They must have, safety must be baked into everything that we're doing. So you just follow the books. I mean, that's sort of all you do, and you don't really think about it. But when you go down one or two rabbit holes, you're like, oh, what, really? That's really why we do it this way? And then you keep doing it, and I kept doing it. And, every story is a little bit different. Like sometimes there was an evil car company CEO trying to make sure we measure safety in a way that made cars look safe. But a lot of
Yeah.
times, like the research, at the time has said, yeah, wider roads are safer. So like that idea perpetuated,
Hmm.
for the next 80, 100 years. But when you look at the original paper that said that, they measured a road that was 18 feet wide, like curb to curb, 20 feet, 22, 24. And yes, the 24-foot road was safer than the 18-foot road. But for whatever reason, like the idea perpetuated, but not the actual study. Like we stopped citing that study 10, 20 years later.
Mm.
Um, and we just extrapolated the mentality to like 60, 80, 100-foot road. Like, does
Yeah.
that original study mean that a 100-foot road is safer than a 60? Well, no, but we thought it did. So we kind of kept pushing in that direction. And I think a lot of, and the way I explain it sometimes is like transportation became more theory based and empirically based, and we
Mm.
were no longer kind of questioning those things because we thought they were based in science.
Yeah. No, it becomes common knowledge, and then you just kind of continue on your way. And I think I'm trying to remember I can't remember exactly the details, but it was similar for like lane width, right? Where I think you even cited a project that you worked on where, it was a parking lot and you like the base assumption for lane width would have been this. And, since we knew like wider lanes are safer, we, made them even bigger. And of course you're like, now that I know what I know, maybe I wouldn't have done that.
Oh yeah, and I think this is partially I think because transportation engineering is a part of civil engineering. Like
Mhm.
everything we learn in civil engineering has to do with factor of safety. Like we
Yeah.
talked about a beam before. Like once the beam is big enough, anything bigger is better. Like it might cost you more. Like a culvert, you design a culvert. Once you get it big enough, that's good, but you can make it even bigger and it's even safer. And Mother Nature doesn't care though. Mother Nature is not going to rain more or less because of like your one culvert that you built. At the same time, transportation is not like that. Like if people behave the exact same way on a narrow lane or a wide lane or on a narrow road or a wide road or like with a big turning radius or a small one, if they behave the exact same way, then yes, it probably would be safer, but they don't.
Mm.
Humans respond. Like there's things like risk compensation. Like when we feel safer, like you pay less attention. And when you look around the world, like a lot of the roads that are the most well engineered end up being some of the least safe. And then
Mhm.
like this is just a huge disconnect. It didn't make a lot of sense. So we're building the least safe roads, and all the ones that were built before traffic engineers ever existed are safer. Like there's something wrong here.
Yeah, that was the thing that I was kind of blown away by is, everything up to the traffic engineer's dream is not as safe as the, like, I don't know, yeah, the original roads of an old downtown or something like that. So can you talk more about why that is? Like, why does, doing some of the like standards of traffic engineering change our behavior and make it, a road less safe?
I mean, well, there's a lot of research talking about what's called a clear zone, and clear zone is supposed to be the area off the side of the road where if there's a driver that's out of control or drunk or whatever it is, they can go off the road and recover and not hit something and be okay, right? So we started this on rural highways. We would
Mhm.
remove all the trees from the edge of the road, right? And it sort of makes perfect sense. Like before that, a lot of people were dying when they ran off the road, hit a tree, and the tree is a fixed object, just an immovable object, and oftentimes the tree won, and the person in the car didn't survive. So, the easy thing to do is just remove the trees. But when you think about a road with trees right up along the edge, like a narrow road with trees, how do you drive on that road compared to one where all the trees have been removed and it's just
Yeah.
very wide open? Like people, and I think we can all imagine this, like you drive a lot faster on the more open road.
Hmm.
So, like, yes, we were reducing the number of people dying when they hit a tree, but we weren't actually reducing deaths. So we were actually getting more deaths. And the bigger problem happened when we started bringing that sort of design mentality into more urban places. When you started removing the trees and the things on the side of the road in a city, um, you know, you're also putting the pedestrians and the bicyclists in that clear zone. So,
Yeah.
we're telling the drivers like, oh, this is your recovery area. So if you're out of control, um, you're going to go over here and you're going to be okay. But that's the same exact place where we're telling pedestrians to walk and bicyclists to ride. And it just doesn't make a lot of sense. Like we can use design instead of making it the most forgiving and biggest design we can, we could do the opposite. Like we can try to entice certain behaviors by designing it in a way where it gets the behaviors we want instead of just trying to protect against the behaviors we don't.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I remember after reading your book, I see it in myself all the time. The way I drive, in a crowded downtown with lots of pedestrians around, is way different than on a suburban kind of like. I think everybody can imagine a road like this in their city that's got four lanes on each side, and the drive-throughs, and it's
Yeah.
supposed to be high speed, but or supposed to be a kind of a commercial corridor, but it's high speed traffic, and like you just drive differently because of how that that built environment is. And it's once you once you notice it, you're like you kind of see it everywhere.
Oh, I remember it was maybe 10 years ago. I was in San Francisco visiting a friend of mine, and he was driving me around the city, and he was whipping around really fast. I'm like, man, what are you doing? Like, and I kind of explained some of the safety statistics. Like, if you hit a pedestrian at 20 miles an hour, there's like only a 15% chance they die. At 30 miles an hour, it goes up to 45% chance. At 40 miles an hour, it's like an 85% chance they die. And he's like, oh, I had no idea. And after that, he still tells me he still drives way slower just by knowing some of those basic numbers.
Yeah, yeah. Um, well, and I think one of the other things that I took away from that section of the book where you're talking about safety and kind of how we've looked at it historically is the different counts of like how we measure safety on roads. So can you talk a little about that? Like, especially like the different ways over time that the kind of industry has measured safety and like what we're actually measuring sometimes versus like when we think we're measuring safety. I thought
I mean,
that like discussion was
yeah,
fascinating, and it's kind of wonky, but it's really interesting.
a little bit. I'll try to keep things at a high level. Like, so basically, I mean, we don't want to just measure the number of crashes or the number of fatalities or severe injuries or something. Like, we want to have what's called an exposure metrics. We want to normalize that crash number so it's more of an apples to apples comparison. And the way we do it now, it's usually like crashes or fatalities is the numerator, and the denominator is vehicle miles traveled, so how far we drive. So when you think of it that way, there's two ways to improve safety. One is reduce fatalities, reduce injuries, or reduce crashes. But the other way to get better safety is actually to increase how much we drive.
Hmm.
And I always sort of wonder, like, what? This doesn't make a lot of sense. Like if you drive 10 miles to work and I drive 1 mile, and if I had, let's say, two crashes and you had like four crashes, like you're still safer than me,
Yeah, yeah,
right? It doesn't really make sense. Like you were saying that, you only had four crashes. Like the numbers don't add up. Like it doesn't really explain what it would be like, the what it feels like as a human in the world. So when I look back as to why we do it that way and why we don't treat it like every other human health outcome,
hmm,
like everything else, like cancer rates, everything else is per population. Like it's a population based metric. But in transportation, it was always a VMT one. And that's the time when I found, that Paul Hoffman, he was the president and CEO of Studebaker. Like in 1930s, he didn't like how cars are being made to look unsafe. So he
hmm,
made the right point that we need an exposure metric, and he tried a bunch of them, and he ended up picking the one he liked best. And he wrote a book about it, and he ended up barnstorming the country, explaining this new metric to this new burgeoning discipline of traffic engineering. And we said, yeah, sure, we're going to use this. And then, like 20 years later, it gets codified into the federal rules, and we're still
wow,
using it that way. Um, but when you actually look at it, it's not an appropriate way to measure safety, and actually leads us to sometimes the wrong answers.
yeah, yeah. Well, I think uh, the like you had a discussion about like every conference you go to, like there's some slide about how the roads in America are the safest they've ever been because the
Yeah,
fatalities per vehicle mile traveled is like so low, and it's more a function of like how much more we are driving than it is there being fewer deaths and crashes and
yeah,
accidents. And, like that just
yeah.
juxtaposition is fascinating. Where people in the industry are like, "This we're so safe," and then everybody else is, or not everybody else, but if you looked at the data a different way, you'd be like, "This is the most dangerous time to ever be on a road," or
And I've been starting to do the same thing. And after I show that first slide, I'll show, the infamous "Mission Accomplished" banner from the aircraft carrier. But then I flip it and I show if we actually measure it these other ways, we get a completely different answer.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and then this I kind of want to stay on the data because I think it's fascinating. But the other thing I thought was interesting is the types of accidents that occur on different types of roads are different, but they're counted the same in this data. So like, you know, I, and then you can get into some of the equity components around the property damage piece that you talked about too. But I thought it was interesting that like if you're looking at traffic accidents at a high level, you might see more accidents in a downtown core where traffic is slower and there's more congestion, but they're fender benders. There's not a lot of damage. Most people walk away. But if you're seeing crashes in some of these high speed areas or lots of vehicle miles traveled are happening, those are serious accidents. So that was also like thinking about it that way too, where like, oh, and these roads that look dangerous, if you look at this metric this way, are actually, pretty safe in terms of like injury and death. But the ones where there's fewer like are like high risk like accidents to from a anyway. I know I don't know where the question is there, but I just thought that was an interesting thing to like struggle with.
Yeah, and I think that's why, like, we think some of that early research is better than it was, like, because they were just assuming that crash severity is proportional. Like
Yeah.
you could count total fender benders, and that would be proportional to fatalities. Or sometimes people even say you can even count like near misses, and that would be proportional to fatalities. But what actually happens when you dig further into the data is that oftentimes you get more fender benders in places where you have way fewer fatalities, and vice versa. So, if we're trying to minimize fender benders, we would build it one way, and that's the way we've been doing it. If we were trying to minimize fatalities and severe injuries, we would actually build it very differently, but we never connected the dots there. So part of it is just we were measuring the wrong thing. And, similar to what we just talked about in terms of the metrics of how we measure safety big picture, but the same thing, like focusing on fender benders, that's useful for the insurance companies and just our general annoyance, but it's not actually useful as a human health impact.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and then you had a discussion also about like in some states, if depending on the threshold at which there is property damage, they get filed as a traffic accident or not. And so like the data can be pretty drastic, like state to state or, community to community, as you're thinking about, how valuable the cars are that are running into each other.
Yeah, I think I joked that if two Teslas like bump each other, it's going to end up in our crash database. But if I total my first car I bought for $800 when I was 16, it would not get into the crash database unless somebody gets hurt. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense. But I mean, the police are just, it makes sense from their standpoint. They want a threshold. They don't want to spend time, writing up police reports for every little thing.
Yeah.
I mean, they're already out there mostly helping the insurance companies, but at the same time, it makes sense why there's a threshold, but you can also see how it leads to biases in our data.
Yeah, and I wanted to belabor the data a little bit because I think one of my things I was taught is what gets measured, is what gets changed. And so if you're thinking about data, it's sometimes good to, especially if you're working in city administration and you hear about how safe roads are, it's good to like challenge that a little bit and be like, how are we looking at this, and understand some of those underlying things that you expose that like make you rethink about some of the data that you're seeing around traffic safety.
Well, and everybody wants like a data-driven approach to road safety, and it makes perfect sense why they would. But if you take a few minutes to dig into the data and like what it's actually telling us, what's missing from it, like where there's biases, and what it's even telling us, like one of the bigger themes of the book is the human error issue. Like if you look at the data, it tells us we have this huge human error problem. But if you start asking yourself, well, why do these road users do what they do? Oftentimes there's an engineering solution that we could come up with, but instead we focused on educating people, just telling them they should behave safer or enforcing it with the police. And like for a lot of traffic engineers, the thinking is, well, we put out a safe system, and if everyone just followed the rules of the road, there'd be no one dying. But this is your fault because you're not doing that.
Yeah. So, well, why is that assumption that it's always typically the conclusion that gets drawn is that it's driver error? Like, where did that come from? I know you like slightly hit the 3 E's that I wanted to ask you about.
Yeah.
But,
there was actually a study from the 70s by a guy named John Treat that he dug through a lot of crashes, and he showed that there's a human error component in, I think he had like 92.4%. And then the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, not that long ago, had a report come out that said it's like 94% of fatalities have a human error. Even though they say in that too is like, don't actually treat this as the cause of the crashes. But I mean, I think that's why we all think, what do you do with data like that? When we think that 94% of our fatalities are human error caused, well, the first thing to think is like, well, we need to fix their behaviors. Like that's the problem. We never think that engineering has much to do with it. Or I guess we sit back and think, well, maybe technology can save the day. We just assume, autonomous vehicles will remove those, bad behaviors, those mistakes from the system, and will reduce our fatalities by 94%. And none of that is true. And, we've tried for decades and decades to try to educate people. And, there's very little evidence that any of that works or works in the long term. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that, some of those scare tactics people use for years end up often leading to the opposite. We end up getting worse outcomes because of those things.
Oh, really? Is there an example you could share about, like, hey, this is the kind of problem, a traffic engineer might see, and this is why they would conclude education or enforcement would be the problem, but how it could be solved with engineering instead?
I mean, there's a lot of examples. I mean, I would say
Thousands
almost.
come to mind. Yeah.
I mean, some of the fundamental ones would be like if somebody like jaywalks and
Yeah.
gets hit and dies, right? So what do we do? Well, we figure out which road user was at fault. Like, was it the driver? Was it the pedestrian? In a case like that, well, it'd be the pedestrian, right? So it's pretty cut and dry. Like that crash gets into our database saying that this pedestrian was at fault. But if you, a lot of times, you just look at the built environment and the transportation system that we put in front of these folks, like this person, like why were they crossing where they were crossing? It's like,
Yeah.
well, like the nearest crosswalk was a half mile away. And then if you go a half mile to that crosswalk, it's not even a good crosswalk at this intersection. Then you look even in between there's like no sidewalks. They're missing. Like there's a lot of problems with it. So from the perspective of that pedestrian, like they were doing what was very rational to them. Like it made the most sense to them in that time. They weren't trying to die, but they ended up doing so, and we blame them for doing so. But if you look at the situation we put them in, we could have done a lot better. We could have
Mhm.
given them a safer place to cross. There was more reasonable distance, and we could have provided better sidewalks in between where they were and where they were going. And you see this sort of time and time again. And I think a lot of like our guidebooks tell us that crashes are these random events, but more often than not, they're systematic. It's
Yeah.
actually something we can predict.
Yeah. Well, it's like it is. And if it's something you can predict, then it's something you can prevent through, a change
Yeah,
in the built environment. Yeah.
exactly. I think I have a sentence like that in the book somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah. Don't mean to be accidentally quoting you after. Um, So, the other thing that I think is fascinating, I'd love to hear you talk a bit about, is how engineers come up with a design speed for a road and how that has, negatively impacted safety. Because I think that's one thing that I know, if you're in, public administration, you may not know the science or not the approach to that or the reason, the roads are the way they are. And then like you can fall into like blaming the driver for speeding or blaming the pedestrian for whatever if you don't know kind of the how some of those things got formed.
Yeah, no, that's something I was always curious about when I was designing streets and stuff like that. Is like we don't traffic engineers don't consider speed to be an issue. Like speed isn't a safety issue as long as most drivers are within what we call a 10-mile-an-hour pace. So if most drivers are going about the same speed, it doesn't matter if they're going 70 or 80 or 30 or 40. Like the thinking is that's the safest thing we can do. So because of that, we use what's called the 85th percentile rule, where if we have a street out there and trying to figure out what the right speed limit is, we see how fast drivers are going. And let's say there's 100 drivers we kind of measure. Like the 85th fastest out of those 100 is what we'll set the speed limit at or about. So, say the road used to be 30 miles an hour, but everyone is speeding on it. Everyone's going 40, and you see the 85th percentile speed is like 42 or something. Then we will raise the speed limit, and we'll tell you that it's going to make the road safer by doing that. And when you look at the original study it was based on, it's like this study in Texas, and there's so many flaws in it. I don't know, you need to
Yeah,
even get
yeah,
into the details in it. And that study's since been debunked multiple times. And, a lot of the research just shows fundamental physics of it is that yes, more speed leads to worse outcomes, all other things being equal. So it's just not true, but we're still doing it that way. Like this is still the protocols we use to set a speed limit. I joke about how letting drivers vote with their feet as to what the speed limit should be. And it doesn't make a lot of sense if we're really
yeah,
focused
yeah.
on safety, but we're kind of not in most instances.
Yeah, well, and it seems like an easy way for it to be a self-fulfilling like cycle where they drive 40, or the 85th percentile is 40, so you make it 40, and now people are driving 45, and so it keeps going up and up and up.
Oh
You
yeah,
keep having
and,
to widen the road.
Yeah, California had a rule that they weren't allowed to enforce the speed limit unless they'd done a safety study within a certain number of years. I don't know if it was like 5 years or something. So if they haven't done a speed study within the last 5 years, they couldn't enforce the speed limit. And then they often didn't want to do a speed study because if they did, then it would raise the speed limit.
Hmm.
So they ended up in this vicious cycle where they would try to improve safety by doing this speed study and then realize they had to raise the speed limit if they wanted to do enforcement.
Yeah.
So they would raise the speed limit and do enforcement, and then people end up driving faster. So they would do another speed study, and they end up in this vicious cycle where, there was this one road near a university in California where all these pedestrians had been killed there, and they kept raising the speed limit, trying to make it safer because that's what the protocols were leading them to do, and it
Wow.
wasn't working. They
Yeah.
led to worse results every time, but this was what we had put out there as the way we do things.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's yeah. That's well. And so the other like end of the equation, or maybe the other side of that is if you want to reduce the speed, reduce the speed that folks are driving in a on like other than just doing a traffic study and increasing it again, like what are the tools that engineers have traditionally used to like try and reduce speed, or has that just not been something that has been a goal?
I Until maybe the late '90s, 2000s, it just wasn't a goal because we never really thought of speed as the problem, right? So
It was safer to
yeah,
go faster. Yeah.
yeah, and I think a lot of people think that they don't want to be the slow driver on the road. They think being slow is more dangerous than being fast, and it's just not true when you look at the research. And maybe the late '90s, early 2000s, we started doing traffic calming type things,
Mm.
especially in neighborhoods and more urban places. So that is some of the earlier times. A lot of people were just worried about the liability of it, and
Mm.
a lot of the research shows that ended up not being a problem. So today there's more of a thinking where we can do more self-enforcing roads where we
Yeah.
don't actually have to use police enforcement or cameras, where the road itself is telling people what to do. And that's actually how most people behave. They behave to the design of the road, and they will go what the speed limit, not that what the speed limit is telling them, but what the design of the road is telling them.
Yeah.
So this also speaks to that human error thing. When we design this a big wide road and we put a sign up that says 30 and people go 50, like we blame them if they kill somebody, right? But
Yeah.
to me, that is our fault as traffic engineers for designing it in that way. We should be trying to design it to get the sort of behaviors we're looking for.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and then if they're not behaving the way you want it, you go back to the engineering and
Yeah.
make more adjustments. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, but our data is telling us that we just need to teach these people to drive slower, and we'll put out a PSA that tells them to. I mean, does that work? Not really. So,
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
enforcement, like we can do police enforcement, but it's usually short term, or it could lead to a lot of unintended consequences,
Mhm.
especially in minority communities. So, I mean, it's neither of those have proven to be something that can work in the long term. So, I think we need to go back to the drawing board in terms of what we're putting out there in terms of the engineering.
Yeah. So, what do you think? You're. I like to always ask sometimes with books like this, where if you got put in charge of a public works department in Denver and got to control kind of, the built environment around some of these streets, like what would be your approach if you were trying to like, change this and especially if you got to like do it in a city and and make some of these kind of engineering changes.
I think the first thing would be to just flip the way we think about all those crashes, like not
Yeah.
let them be about human error. So really, just ask in every situation where somebody died or was seriously injured, like why they did what they did. How can we use engineering to fix it? Like the second bigger thing I would do is like stop trying to fix traffic congestion. Like
Yeah.
we're asking the wrong question. Like the goal of transportation is not just low congestion, it's to get people where they're going. And if we're focused entirely on fixing traffic congestion, it narrows our solution set. Like we end up,
Mm.
just thinking we need to add more lanes, even though for the last 100 years we've seen time and time again that adding more lanes doesn't actually fix congestion. you end up right where you were in the first place. So if we think about the goal of transportation being about getting people to jobs, to school, to opportunities, the social events, your subset of answers for how to do that, one of them could be reducing traffic congestion, but you get a whole set of other things you could do. I mean, you could make walking and biking safer. You could even change where like A and B are located to make them closer. Like that is
Mm.
one way to solve the transportation problem. But we're also focused on fixing traffic congestion that we're missing the bigger picture.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You're narrowly focused on that. You miss. Yeah, you're right. You missed other modes. So I'm curious. The traffic engineering profession, like how does it think about pedestrian and bikes and all that stuff? Because you have talked a lot about safety, but it's all been in the context, or we've talked a lot about it, and it's all been in the context of drivers. And it seems like that's one of your critiques as well from the book.
I mean, historically, it's been an afterthought. I mean, it is getting better, but like I know there was when I was a young engineer, and I was in Connecticut at the time, and the Connecticut DOT just instituted a rule where on every project you had to, accommodate pedestrians and bicyclists if they were there. So, what you would normally do is you go out and see if there are pedestrians and bicyclists there, count them, and try to, make sure you build sidewalks and appropriate bike facilities. But I know somebody that went out in the middle of the night to do the counts, and they said there was no bikes or pedestrians. And then when they went to design it, they didn't have to accommodate them because there were none. And it's like, whoa, like, what are you doing? Like,
Yeah,
this is totally missing the point. So, um, like now I think we're doing a better job, but there's still an afterthought in most places. Like it's
yeah,
still your second, third class citizens. Like we're still focused much more on cars, not even cars today. We're the way we do things. We're looking at cars, the predicted number of cars 20 years in the future, and we're trying to
mm,
accommodate that. And that's the focus more so than the people that live and work on a certain street. Like
yeah,
trying to make it safe for them and making safety the priority for those folks could be our protocol and the way we do business, but it's really just looking at this future traffic volumes. And that the funny thing is we haven't even solved the congestion problem that is all set up to solve. Like we
mm,
failed at what we're trying to do, and we're also not doing safety. So if we flip it and actually focus on safety, it might help.
yeah, yeah. Well, I know. I think I can't remember if we talked about this example already or not, but you talked about the clear zones, and like now I see it everywhere. The street poles or traffic light poles, like I'll have the breakaway at the bottom, and it's like in the sidewalk, and you're like, it's you can really tell that where how whose safety is prioritized in intersections like that.
Well, even like the better cities, like what they're often doing is protected bike lanes. So they're
Yeah,
putting those little flex posts, like the white plastic things. And you look at the way those are designed to pop back up if a car goes over them at 70 miles an hour. Like that's what they're meant for. Like, so they're not real protection. It's
yeah,
more just a visual element. Like if we really were truly focused on keeping like bicyclists safe, like those would be bollards like that would be designed in a way to have a little give to it so the driver of the car could be safe, but they'd also be protecting the bicyclists and the pedestrians. But that's not the way we're doing it. We're designing them, it's more like a vertical painting. That's
yeah,
all
yeah.
it's really doing. It doesn't, and there's, I mean, so many people that are dying in those bike lanes that they think are safe, but they're not
Hmm.
quite there.
Yeah. Well, it's the one of the like urbanist things I've seen is like paint is not infrastructure. It's like those those little reflector strips aren't really infrastructure
Yeah.
either. If you can drive right over them, yeah.
Oh yeah,
Um,
I mean, the worst examples are sharrows, like those the
yeah,
shared use marking, like that's the little bike symbol in the street telling, supposed to tell drivers and I guess bicyclists too that it's a shared road that bicyclists are allowed to be here, but it's just paint. Like in it,
yeah,
if you look at the research, including one of my papers, we found they actually lead to worse safety. Like it,
yeah,
I mean, you're putting bicyclists often in a bad situation with all these big cars that go fast and them thinking they should be there, and it doesn't work out. So we actually need to, given the way our streets are currently designed, we need to give them a safer place to be.
yeah, yeah. Well, that was another. That reminds me of another one of the. I think as you dug into the underlying data or studies behind it was there you didn't find much. There was the separated bike lanes or protected bike lanes, and like there was some study. I'm half remembering this, but some study that it was the reason it wasn't necessary was because they were actually less safe from some study many years ago, and that's why there's not
Oh
often
yeah, no.
protected bike lanes in our communities. Is based on
Back in
this.
the
Yeah.
60s and 70s, protected bike lanes were pretty common. And then John Forrester, he was an advocate in like Berkeley, California. I think he was an industrial engineer, so he was not in transportation at the time whatsoever. But he did like this one study where he rode on the protected bike lanes as fast as he normally did on the streets, and he said he had like a bunch of near collisions. And then he measured that against his time in like the regular streets where he normally rode. And he, I can't remember what the numbers were, but he was like, oh, this is 300 times more dangerous to be on a protected bike lane or on a trail than it is to be in the street. And like he ended up writing a book and doing something similar, like trying to really put it out there. And for whatever reason, traffic engineers bought this. And, when I was in grad school, I took a safety course, and I remember my professor telling me that it's safer for a bicyclist to be in the street than it is to be on an off-street trail. And I'm like, how is that possibly possible? Like
Yeah.
that makes no sense to me. And it
Have
turns
you
out
ever
it
ridden a bike,
wasn't.
buddy?
It wasn't true, but that's like for decades, that's what we were designing, thinking that that is the best way to provide bike safety. And even telling like 12-year-old kids that this is where they should be biking. And that was one of the things that John Forrester would suggest is like, kids should be doing this too. And if we're not teaching them to bike in the street with these cars and drivers, then we're failing. It was just, we were going the wrong direction, and there was nobody really questioning it in the way that we should have.
Yeah.
There were a few lone voices, but nobody caught on until more recently.
Yeah, it was just accepted with wisdom as one
Yeah.
of those things that doesn't get challenged. Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And for someone that's biked around a couple of cities, like the difference between being a protected bike lane or a separated lane to being with traffic is quite noticeable.
Oh yeah, especially now as cars have increased in
Oh yeah,
size and speed, and it. I mean, you're asking. It's like a death sentence to put a kid out there on a bike in front of some of these big pickup trucks you see. Like, why would we ever want that? Like that, that doesn't make any sense. So,
yeah,
yeah, we can do better.
yeah, agreed. Um, so I'm curious. The book's been out for a bit. Like, what's kind of been the reaction to folks that are in the industry with you? Like, how is it? How's it kind of gone over?
Overwhelmingly positive. There's definitely a small minority of traffic engineers that don't really love the title. If they did read it, they would know that I'm really not blaming them because this is what they were taught. They were doing what
Yeah,
they were taught. Like there's a good reason why we all think these guidebooks are steeped in 100 years of science, and I'm going to show them in my book that it's not. But so there were a few people on some kind of online forums saying that I should resign and that nobody should read my book and that they refuse to read it too. But from my perspective, like the examples they were giving were exactly what I was talking about in my book. So they were actually proving my point. So I kind of really enjoyed some of that. And
yeah.
it's been useful to talk about. I mean, because they were literally giving examples that I show why the problems with it, like in my book. So it was useful. So, I think it's been good. So I've
Yeah.
the interesting thing too is that it's not just been sort of transportation people reading it. I'm hearing from a lot of different people. Someone like you on a podcast like this that isn't necessarily your realm, but it's gotten out there more than I think I thought it would, or the publisher thought it would, which has been fun too.
Yeah, that's really cool. Well, and I'm curious, how do you think so it's good that, it's, you've got a good reception for it, but how do you think the industry needs to change? Like if they were to adopt some of the things in the book, or like, how would you change maybe how traffic engineers are trained, or like you already mentioned some of the data pieces, or like how they would approach their job if they work for a city, but like, what about kind of the industry maybe as a whole?
That's a big question. I think we could go for another hour talking about that. And I have a whole section on education because, when I was an undergraduate, I took one transportation engineering course, and I ended up getting my professional licensure in like transportation engineering and civil engineering, having only taken one course. And I thought that was rare. I thought maybe other people took more at their university, and that wasn't true. Like maybe they took two, maybe three, but a lot of people I came to find out later took zero. Like
Mm.
you don't actually have to have a transportation engineering course in your undergraduate, like in an accredited university, to get a civil engineering degree. So one of the professors I work with, she took zero as an undergrad. She worked for some years. She got her professional engineering licensure, and she worked as a professional in transportation engineering for 2 decades until she came back and got her master's with us. And that doesn't make any sense, right?
Hmm.
There's so much wrong with that. Yeah, I guess in terms of your other question too, like man, I feel like we need to go back to being more of an empirical science. Like we've been
Mm.
so steeped in these theories and just assuming that these old research is right on. And at the very beginning of the book, I kind of compare us to doctors. Like medicine, doctors have been around for 5,000 years. It's not hard to argue for the first 1,000 years that they might have killed more people than they saved.
Mm.
But as an empirical science, like they're getting better and better. They're still not perfect, but we realize that it's something they're trying to use data to get better with. And we've stopped doing that in transportation engineering. Like we've a lot of times just focused on the theories and continuing on that. And we're still at a stage, we're only like 100 years old or so. And
Mm.
I would argue that we're still killing more people than we save.
Mm.
If we want to get past that and move on to like out of the dark ages, I think we need to become more empirical again and really start looking at what works and not what we think will work. Because, like we talked about at the very beginning, transportation is very counterintuitive, and we don't
Yeah,
often get what we expect when we add humans to the mix.
those pesky humans. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's what makes it more interesting and fun. Like I
Exactly.
mean, that's why I'm here, and that's why I do this instead of, just doing the structural engineering
Yeah.
stuff.
Instead of stormwater. Yeah, that's not
Yeah.
nearly as fun. Yeah. Well, and, I also liked your. Yeah, I think you wrote a little bit about the difference between being a generalist and a specialist, and like maybe if you're only focused on traffic and you see or cars is maybe the best example of if, then you only see certain solutions, and if you broaden your aperture a little bit and you think about land use and people that are walking and biking, like you have a different perspective on it too, and like the problems that you're trying to solve.
Yeah, I mean, I just talked about how you might take only one course, and a lot of
Mm.
people would argue that traffic engineering is too siloed. I'm like, you don't even teach our students enough to have their own silo. Like, they don't know any better than just to use the guidebooks. But if you take a step back and wonder, like, well, how would we actually train someone if we want them to do this sort of work? It would not be with structural engineering courses where the whole mentality is a factor of safety and bigger is better. It
Hmm.
would not be with hydrology courses where it's like, again, bigger is better. It might be with a public health course
Mm.
or, something where you might help you understand the impact of transportation on things like public health or, what happens when a highway cuts through your neighborhood and houses are being repossessed and how that becomes a barrier and what this means for the social issues or the economic issues. Like we don't teach our students anything about those, but they're the ones going into public meetings trying to
Yeah.
explain to some community that, hey, we need to widen this road and repossess your house and put it right through there. Like, so and you think about it like that, it makes perfect sense that we need something broader, something more
Yeah.
comprehensive. Like, yes, we still need to understand the design, like that specialist, like that specialty is still important. But, I mean, that goes back to what we first talked about. Like, that's why I'm reading all these books and
Hmm.
that are way beyond my field. It gives me a better understanding of, the world and
Yeah.
how transportation plays a role in not just moving cars from A to B, but in all aspects of life. And it's really is fundamental in so many things that the traffic engineering protocols don't consider whatsoever.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's well said. And that's the fun part of working for cities and working with local governments is like all the complexity, all the different things that get into making a community, and just broadening that is great. But that's what makes it fun.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I do in one of my classes, I just ask like, "What is transportation for?" And then
Yeah.
it's the first discussion on the first day, and most people will say, "Well, it's for moving cars, I mean, moving people and goods from A to B." Um, and that's part of it, but transportation can be about so much more. Like it is more about helping people access opportunities and
Yeah.
access, and we
Building
miss that when
community
we're,
and connection. Like, yeah. Yeah.
yeah, if you focus on the first definition, then you're really focused on increasing speed and mobility. If you focus on the second definition, you're really focused on helping people access like doctors and like
Hmm.
schools and things like that. And you get a different answer.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Awesome. Well said. Um, So we'll link to the where you can get the book in the show notes, and I really encourage our listeners to check it out because it was a great read. But I'm curious, before we wrap up, what's next? What are you working on that our listeners should look out for?
So I've been doing, various interviews, podcasts. It's been fun. So it's been fun to talk about these things. It's a little bit overwhelming sometimes. It's hard to
Yeah,
get my real work done to some extent, but I guess it's better than the alternative if no one is paying any attention to the book whatsoever. So it's been busy but good.
yeah. Back to maybe some more regular work once you're the
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, I have a
80
lot of
cycles out.
ideas for like what could come next in terms of a book, but this book was such a big undertaking that it would take some time.
Yeah,
It's not the kind of book I would write in a couple months. There's a lot of research involved in this sort of stuff, and so yeah, I'm not quite to that point yet, but I have ideas.
yeah. Awesome. Well, cool. Well, then another tradition we have on the podcast is always the hardest question for guests. So, if you could be the GovLove DJ, what song would you pick as the exit music for this episode?
So in the original draft of my book, like every chapter was actually named after a song title, and that was one of the things the publisher pushed back on, and I was okay with it. It ended up being better. And if you still look, there's still a handful of song titles that remain. That's just not quite as obvious. But towards the end of the book, one of the song titles was like "We're Not Going to Take It," the Twisted Sister song
Yeah.
from the '80s, and that feels like a good one. After having, if you read this book, I feel like that is kind of feeling I want people to walk away with. It's like we need to get better. Like we're not going to take it. So, Dee Snider, "Twisted Sister." That's my song of choice here.
I love it. I love it. That's perfect. You're right. That after I read the book, that's exactly how I felt. So, so awesome. Well, that ends our episode for today. Wes, thank you so much for coming on and talking to me. I really enjoyed it, and I really appreciate you sharing your expertise and all your experience.
Yeah, this was fun, Ben. Thank you.
Yeah. And for our listeners, GovLove is brought to you by engaging local government leaders, and the best way to support GovLove is to become an ELGO member. You can reach us online at elgo.org/GovLove, and you can also give us a follow on LinkedIn at our GovLove podcast page. Subscribe to GovLove on your favorite podcast app. If you're already subscribed, tell a friend, a colleague, an enemy, a neighbor about this podcast. Help us spread the word that GovLove is the go-to place for local government stories. And with that, thank you for listening. This has been GovLove, a podcast about local government.